Welcome to the Microsoft Exchange Server 2016 course on Mailbox Databases. Mailbox Databases is the heart of Exchange. That's where all your email data is stored, and we have a dedicated course just on Mailbox Databases. But let's introduce ourselves first. So my name is Martin Kutzer. I'm a content developer at Microsoft Learning Experiences, and I specialize in training for Exchange, Skype for Business, and Office 365. I'm also MCSA in Office 365, MCSE in messaging, and all of those alphabet soup that's out there. I have 20 years of experience in the IT industry. I've been a consultant in the field, deploying these very technologies with all sorts of customers out there. So I have lots of experience, and before that, I was even a software developer on a mainframe. So that goes way back. With me is Joe. Joe, tell us about yourself.
Thanks, Martin. My name is Joe Turek. I'm a consultant with Olive & Goose. I've been with Olive & Goose for just shy of a year, primarily involved in technical writing for Exchange, whether it be Exchange on premises or Exchange online, Office 365. Prior to that, I was a support engineer with Microsoft for about 15, 16 years, supporting Exchange. Exchange applications like Outlook Web Access, which is now called Outlook on the Web in 2016, Outlook Anywhere, Outlook connectivity in general, Exchange ActiveSync, those technologies. During that time, I wore many hats. I was one of the Exchange 2007 beta engineers. I've co-written several white papers throughout my time, a couple on Conference Server, which kind of dates me. And co-wrote the Auto-Discover white paper, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you today.
Yeah, so it sounds like you guys are on good hands. We have lots of Exchange experience around the table, and we are going to cover the following topics with you. So the first thing that I want to highlight is this course is like an appetizer for a edX course that Microsoft Learning is going to make available on edX.org. And there's a aka.ms link in the top of this slide that will take you to this course specifically. So this course is focused on Mailbox Databases. Then in this course, we're going to look at the Mailbox Server role itself. What does it do? The Mailbox Server role is a very important role in Exchange. Without that role, you can't do anything, because that is what Exchange now does. We're going to then look at deployment considerations of Mailbox Databases. How do we make the different choices? There's so many things that you can do, and we want to give you some ideas of what is the wrong things to do and what is the right things to do. Then obviously, we're going to talk about high availability. Many organizations is serious about high availability, and we want to make sure that you always think about how do you deploy Exchange in a highly available fashion so that Exchange will never go down. Because if Exchange goes down, then people will complain, people will cry, because people just love their email. And then we have a dedicated module on site resilience. So what happens if everything fails that keeps it up and running? How do we do a site resilient solution as well? And then finally, we're going to look at implementing backups and recovery and restore, so strategies around those as well. So stay tuned, and that's what we're going to do in this course. But before we go there, we want to set some expectations. We want to make sure that you're on the right video. You didn't just accidentally click on this video. So you need to be an IT professional interested in evaluating and deploying and managing Exchange Server 2016. Or Office 365. A lot of the things that we're going to cover is going to be applicable in Office 365 as well. So you don't need to worry in Office 365 about building servers, but a lot of the management and so on that you can do in Office 365, you can also do in Exchange 2016. So the skills sort of overlap there as well. You need to know how Windows Server works. So Windows Server 2012 R2, the roles and features that's available, and specifically Active Directory. Active Directory is the platform that Exchange runs on, and you need to know how Active Directory works, the replication, how sites and services work in Active Directory. And then also, Active Directory depends heavily on DNS, so you need to know how DNS works and how you do name resolution in your organization. And then finally, DNS is dependent on networking, so you need to know how networks work and how TCP/IP and so on is configured and for the mailbox role. So that is all prerequisite language. We're not going to tell you how to configure TCP/IP and so on, but you need to know those things. So if you don't, then I would recommend that you look at other courses in the MVA community. So the Microsoft Virtual Academy has got lots of courses, and there's courses on every imaginable Microsoft product out there. So check them out and then sign up and become one of 3 million registered users. And you can always get up-to-date newsletters about any courses that's coming out in your portfolio. So with that, let's get started with the Mailbox Server role in Exchange Server 2016. So in this course, we're going to talk about the Mailbox Server role specifically. So this is the heart of Exchange, as I said before. This role really is where your planning starts. This is what you do. You start with this component when you implement Exchange. You think about, how am I going to put together the Mailbox role in Exchange Server? When we look at the Mailbox role specifically, we'll give you some overview of how the Mailbox role works, why it got to where it's now, how do the Mailbox Server role interact with clients and the client access services, which is sort of part of the Mailbox Server role. And then we're going to talk about the Mailbox Store, and then some of the changes we have in Mailbox Databases. So that is basically what we need to cover in this course. When we talk about the Mailbox Server role, it's sort of an interesting time that we're in right now, because previously when we referred to the Mailbox Server, it meant we were talking about databases, the storage of email. But over time, the Mailbox Server role got the hub transport components. That's the components that is responsible for sending and receiving emails in your organization. It also got the unified messaging server role. That's the role that's responsible for accepting voicemail messages and interacting with the PBX, where you can dial into your mailbox and you can listen to your mail, maybe if you want to do something like that on your way to work. And then now in Exchange 2016, it also got the client access services. So when we talk about the Mailbox Server role, we really are talking about the Exchange Server. The Exchange Server's got everything on there. And in this module, we're going to focus specifically on the Mailbox Database part of the Mailbox Server role. So the database, how do you create databases, all the functionality around databases, mounting databases and dismounting databases and so on. So this is about how do you set up the storage and so on around the Mailbox Server role.
That's a good point, Martin. I mean, but in addition to that, I mean, it's just now the Mailbox role is everything except the edge transport role. So it kind of reminds me in a way, when you look at the architecture of Exchange 2003, when you had front end, back end servers. Now, granted, that's more aligned with a front end would be your CAS server and your back end would be a Mailbox server. But even in the Mailbox Server role today in 2016, you do have a client access services layer, which communicates with the back-end services layer on the same server. Yeah. So it's interesting that now people don't have to worry about how they're going to deploy their client access server roles as opposed to Mailbox Server roles, and the ratio of how many CAS servers to Mailbox servers. It simplifies a lot of things.
So it's almost like, if you know the history around Exchange has gone full circle. We started back in the day when Exchange was introduced as a product with everything on the same server. Everything, including the directory, was running on that same server. And through different architecture changes, that slowly became different servers. And it was really because we needed the capacity, we needed performance. Hardware at the time couldn't deliver what we wanted, so we had to split those roles into different components and different servers. And then as hardware caught up again with the performance and the capacity that we needed, those roles came back to one place. So all of them are back in one place again, except for the directory. The directory will still be Active Directory. It's not like we're going to...
We're not going back to 5.5
yeah,
days.
5 days where Exchange will run its own directory. So again, you can run Exchange on its own domain controller, but it's really not a good idea to install Exchange on its own, because that causes problems with performance issues. You know, the DC is going to compete for CPU and memory on that machine. The Exchange is obviously going to compete for CPU and memory on that same machine. And it's also a bit of a security issue, because if something happens on that domain controller, that will affect the Exchange server, or if something happens on the Exchange server, it will affect the domain controller. So we really don't recommend that you run Exchange on a domain controller. That is a bad idea. But other than that, to sort of make it as simple as possible, we keep everything on one server. It's not a complex thing to then think about. You need to have so many client access servers, you need to have so many hub transport servers and so on. You just deploy all of them and they magically work together. All of the intelligence is built into the product to make sure that scenario works. And you don't have to go into a really complex design to figure out how many global catalog servers do you need. You always need to have enough GCs. The ratio is 8:1. But how many client access servers do you need for every mailbox server? Because everything is self-contained in a single building block. So in the slide that I have here is an architecture where on the inside we have our enterprise network, which is running maybe a database availability group, which we'll talk about later. And then you have mailboxes in there, and everything that is required for Exchange to run is on that server. It speaks to Active Directory, but everything else is in that server, contained in that server. You load balance all of those. Sometimes you still need your edge transport server in your perimeter network. Many organizations have edge transport servers, so that server is designed to be in the perimeter network, so it needs to be separate. So physically, it cannot be the same mailbox server. So that's why that role is still separate, but the mailbox servers has got everything. Everything is loosely coupled. The functionality, the versioning, user partitioning, and due affinity. All of those things ensures that a mailbox server can be replaced with a server that's upgraded to a newer version, and they work perfectly together. You load balance that same pool, and Exchange will get a client request and make sure that it gets to the right mailbox on the where the mailboxes are running. So all of these things come together well, and it's just so much less complexity. And when we remove complexity out of any Exchange deployment, we sit with a solution that is less prone to break. You know, the more complexity you add to any solution, the more components you add into that design that can eventually break. And then you have outages and you have sad users. So this is really the story of Exchange Server 2016. So if we look at the Mailbox Server role specifically, this server is the server that houses the logic to route a specific protocol request to the correct destination endpoint. So this is the client access services. The Mailbox Server role has that logic in what we call the client access services to accept the request, authenticate that user, and then figure out where is the best place to connect to where that mailbox database is.
That's the communication between the client access layer and the backend layer,
Yes.
right? And doesn't it use the same protocol? So if the connection is made over HTTPS, then you find the endpoint, and that communication from the client access layer to the back-end layer is done over HTTPS or POP3 or IMAP4.
Yes, exactly. So your connection that comes into the Mailbox server on the client access services side is exactly the same protocol that goes to the Mailbox database. And that is why we call it loosely coupled, because it comes in with that connection. The connection is authenticated, so we know the user connection, where it's coming from. And then we then connect to the right Mailbox database services in the background on the same protocol. So what comes in is the same that goes out.
What if the mailbox, what happens if the active database of that user's mailbox is on a different server in a different Active Directory site?
So two things can happen there. The one thing that can happen is if you've configured the other site to be externally facing because you configured external URLs on client access services, then that client access service knows that this is actually not the best place for this client to connect to. It will know that, oh, its database is in another site. That site has got external URLs configured to it, so it needs to redirect that client. So it will tell the client that you need to connect to this site and you will get your mailbox data.
And when that redirection happens, that's going to go through the client access layer?
That's going through the client access layer again on that side.
Right. But if those external URLs are not set, and I come in through an internet-facing Exchange 2016 server, then won't the client access services layer in that site just simply proxy it to the back-end endpoint?
Exactly.
On the other server?
Yes. Okay. So if it's not set, it will just connect right to the right mailbox database, and it will connect and make your mailbox data available to you. So it's a really simple concept to work to understand. And even if the client access services are Exchange 2013 server, it will be able to connect to a mailbox database that's running on 2016. It's just Exchange 2010. So if you're running Exchange 2010, that client access server would not be able to connect to a Exchange 2016 mailbox server.
Yep.
In that case, you have to replace the client access or the mailbox database server and make that 2016, and it will be able to connect to a 2016 mailbox database. This server, the mailbox server, also hosts all the components of the database. So there's many components that runs the ESE, the database, the mailbox database that runs on the server, and it hosts all of those components to be able to render. So that's in the case of OWA, Outlook on the web.
Outlook on the web.
In the case of Outlook on the web, you know that web page needs to be rendered with all the pictures and so on. All of that is on that mailbox server as well. And then the database themselves, that is also hosted on that server. The services that's running on that server connects to the database, and so this mailbox server is responsible for that as well. None of the clients connect to any of the back-end services of a mailbox database server. That is not allowed in the Exchange 2016 architecture.
Which is really what we just discussed,
yes.
Where all the communication from clients comes in through, the first connection is made to the client access services layer of the 2016 server, and from there it's either redirected or it's proxied. But yeah, the client never will directly communicate with those back-end endpoints.
Yep. There's one exception to this, and that is unified messaging. With unified messaging, the connection is not proxied through client access services. The connection, once it's authenticated, the unified messaging that's running in client access services layer will redirect that PBX system, that is the phone system that needs to call into the mailbox, to the backend services directly, so that transaction happens directly to the backend services. So that's one exception, but it's still standard protocols. It's still the standard
SIP, I believe.
SIP protocol to set up that call, so that it uses SIP, and then obviously it will use whatever codecs you've configured to be able to do the voice part of that connection. This is also the building block, obviously, the Mailbox Server of the Database Availability Group, which is the technology that replicates databases and makes databases highly available. So database availability groups and all the new features that is in Exchange 2016 is part of, let's call it, the evolution of database availability groups. And the technology in there is really amazing, and the things they've done to make sure that your Exchange server never goes down. Because a lot of these features are the product of us running Exchange in Office 365. And so some of the things that they did in Office 365 to make sure that Office 365 never goes down is now available in the product. And we're going to talk about some of those, like auto reseed and so on, that makes Exchange really resilient and makes it hard to take down. So that's an overview of the Exchange server, the Mailbox Server role, and stay tuned for more details on Mailbox Databases.